My name is Dr. Lasana Kazembe. I am an associate professor of education and Africana studies at Indiana University in Indianapolis.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about your article today, The Steep Edge of a Dark Abyss, Mohonk, White Social Engineers, and Black Education. So if you could begin by telling us how you came to discover Mohonk and what you learned in writing about it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I actually learned about the Mohonk conferences while I was doing my graduate work. I'm from Chicago, and I did my graduate work at UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago. So I was always interested, I think, in the history of education, which I teach, and of course, more specifically, the history of Black education, and looking at studying and teaching that history. The evolution of Black education also occurred coterminously almost with the development of the formal United States. So it was just a matter of really just looking to the side, to either side, and then just seeing this and then understanding its relevance to the country. And then the other thing, as I began to dive into it, I found out later on that there were multiple Mohonk conferences. There was a Mohonk conference on the Indian, quote unquote. And then as I began to even, do more of a deeper synthesis, began to see just these frightening parallels between the impulses of that era and the impulses of this era. And really the only thing that's really changed is the date. So you can really strip down, and it's fascinating, but it's also frightening. And so that kind of fueled the research and took it in an even broader direction.
Yeah, that was one of the things I noticed too when I read the first Mohonk notes. The premise, it was just the arguments haven't changed at all, just some of the language around them. But let's begin with what was the first Mohonk conference on the Negro Question, and what were the key objectives that came out of those 3 days?
Well, the way I approach it is it was a question that was really born in fear, and it was born in a fear of a newly freed, formerly enslaved population, some 4 to 5 million or more people. It was the fear over how are we to sort of fit, if you will, these people in the country. And then it was to answer well, what if they don't fit? Because the masses don't fit. What do we do with them? So it was really a question that was born in fear. And then it fell in the laps, obviously, of the elite, those with property and power who have the ability, like Mr. Musk and other people like that, to actually define reality and who can actually make things go. And so that question it really sprung up in the minds of these social engineers and these policy folk, fueled by the millionaire or elite ruling class of that day. And so it was a way to sort of manage, if you will, people. So the two outcomes of Mohonk and essentially engineering the education of Black people was the basic outcome was that they have to be quickly evangelized because of all of the stereotypical things around Black people's habits of thrift and housekeeping and things of that nature, sexual nature and stuff. So there was this idea that needs to be policed, it needs to be controlled, and we need to be able to sort of direct it and predict its outcome or shape its outcome. And the second one was that the rulers would say, we know we cannot reinstitute chattel slavery, but we can quickly train them for domestic service. And so you think about the sorts of industries that came up, you think about this occurring near the turn of the century, the industrialization of the United States. And so you begin to see a need to see a domestic class of stevedores and Pullman porters and wet nurses and things of that nature. So these are the jobs that are most akin to the sort of bondage occupations, fruit picking, scraping the rust from ships, and just all of the shape and barnacles, all of those types of things now. But we're attaching a basic wage to it, really a poverty wage. But it is a way for us to create an economy and to absorb these 4+ million into an economy, into a rapidly developing economy. And also, one of the notes that I mentioned in here, and this is one of the schemes authored, most prevalently by Mr. Abraham Lincoln, was the repatriation schemes that had been discussed and actually bandied about in Congress. Like, well, maybe we can just ship them out. And this is after the railroads and after the fortunes have been made and stuff like that. So there were all of these things that they were juggling. And so the Mohonk Conference was a way for, and these were not fringe conversations, as you know. These were conversations involving the very crust of the society, the people who made things go. And so they were able to affect this across time, and it really shaped and impacted the lives and futures of millions and millions of people.
Yeah, I want to return to that colonization thread in a minute, because I think the end of your article really opens the door to a whole new avenue of thinking about American colonization in general, and that project as we've seen in the 20th century. But I want to return to how you frame the article, because I think it's a really powerful framing device that you set up, which is using Du Bois and Black intellectual tradition against what were white answers to that. What is the Negro question? What is to be done? And just how deploying those two Du Bois and Black intellectual tradition puts in praxis all that white supremacy that came before Mohonk and then came out of Mohonk. So could you explain how you came to that framing device and just what you found deploying it against white supremacy?
That's a great question. And thank you for asking it. And this is my approach to my teaching, to my research, and really to every project that I engage in. When it comes to things like white supremacy and imperialism and stuff like that, I believe that it is imperative, compulsory, that we have a critique, that we have a healthy, courageous, fluid critique that is adaptable. So it is not a critique that is set on any one individual, because the individuals could change. It is not a critique set on any one set of conditions, because the set of conditions can change. But it has to be fluid and adaptable over time. But it's a critique of those things. And the critique meaning a deep analysis. We have to understand the impulses. We have to understand what this means. But then that's not the beginning of the analysis. I'm sorry, that's not the end of the analysis. It's the beginning of the analysis. Personally, I have to go beyond the critique, and I have to look at, okay, I know what they thought about who they wanted us to be and what they wanted us to do. But Black people have always exercised agency and autonomy to the degree that they could. That has always been something. This is what the late great philosopher Kobe Kambon, he calls it the African survival thrust. That there has always been this urge, this impulse among African or Black human beings to author their own futures, to be the architects of their own destinies, and so that is where Du Bois comes into the frame, because he more so than others exemplified that, and he became an exemplar for many of us. And so Du Boisian thought comes out of something, this protracted formation that we call the Black radical tradition in education. It goes back even before him, and it's Pan-African in nature, because we see these sorts of things happening in the Caribbean. If you look at the history of Walter Rodney in Guyana, you look at the history of Steve Biko in South Africa, there's always been this thrust that comes from the people. That was a thrust that encouraged them and gave them the fuel and the lubricant to be able to manage and control and conceptualize the futures that they wanted to have for themselves, despite the assault, the imperialism, the white supremacy, the racism. Because they have to be defined, ultimately, they have to be defined beyond the limited vision of what an oppressor might have in mind for you.
Right, and some of those, even though most of the Mohonk attendees were quote unquote liberal, they were, more on the abolitionist side prior to the war, and then afterwards they were more left than right in today's parlance. But they still didn't invite any African Americans. They still didn't really ask for any input. And they ultimately came to a group of conclusions that some at the conference challenged. And I'd like you to talk about what the exclusion of those African Americans from the designing of the architecture of the Black American educational experience meant.
Well, I think it meant a couple of things. One, what it did was it really revealed the porous sort of formation that we call, quote unquote, the white liberal, because within the operationalized thought and practice of the white liberal, there's often these blind spots that reflect either an inability or a reluctance to self-critique and to really look at it. It reminds me of the quote from Malcolm X when he talked about, if you have a knife in your back and someone pulls it out 3 inches or 4 inches, that's not progress. Progress is removing the knife, healing the wound, and then that's how you get to progress. So there was this tendency, this proclivity among even these white liberals in attendance to, okay, well, we don't want them enslaved. We don't want them lynched. We don't want them set upon, but we also don't want them having any kind of measure of power or equality. We don't want them living across the street from us, but we don't want them in this other situation. So those are some of the limitations of that. And I think also it sort of also spoke to, I think, some form of how might I call it? Maybe hegemonic nostalgia. That is like, how dare you solve your own problems? How dare you conceptualize a way out? No, we are the arbiters of thought, and we are the ones that we will tell you what the solutions are. So I think there's a serious fear of people like Du Bois who had obviously not a gun, but an idea. And white power has always feared an idea. I mean, we have access to the weapons of the U.S. military and stuff. That's not where the fear. The fear is that idea, because the idea can go into the brain and it can twist and twist and twist, and it can become viral and infectious. So I think on some level, there was some reluctance to even involve these learned men and women of the day in this project, because that would mean now possibly that they come with their own set of ideas. Those ideas might be in competition with the ideas that we, the white architects, feel are the ideas. So we don't want that issue. So we'll format this. We'll put this together. But I think it might have been really interesting because I think at least for the first 6 or 7 decades of its existence, the NAACP president was white, and it wasn't, I think, until Walter White, who was he was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white man who presented like a white man, but he was a black man. But the NAACP, for the first few decades, several decades of its existence, was actually controlled by white people within that organization. So it would have been really, really interesting to see a real, more authentic form of liberal thought emerge among these Mohonkers had it been a more diverse audience, because you can just believe that the presence of a Booker T. Washington or Du Bois would have put pressure on those who thought that they had done the best essay and penned the best solution that they could. And then along comes the Wizard of Tuskegee, and along comes, Du Bois to put the smackdown on these feudal ideas and stuff. So it would have been really, really interesting to see that.
Well, I'm reminded, and when you were talking about that, about how quickly after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, the freed slaves, the freed people, really just hit the ground running so hard and fast. I mean, elected people to Congress, elected people to the State House, built schools, built churches, and just were ready to fully participate. And they had to be redefined immediately by all of white society. Otherwise, to incorporate that meant acknowledging, as you said, that whole. And I think that leads me to my next question, which is you mentioned at the beginning kind of the three threads that came out, where you have to make sure everyone's on the same moral ground. You have to have, service economy kind of thing. And then the last one, which I can't remember, but talk a little bit more about the religious aspect of it, because there were a lot of preachers, there were a lot of men of faith at this Mohonk conference, and they had a really specific view of their duty not only as paternal white people, but also the duty of Black people if they're going to enter the society.
Right. That's a great one. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, you don't hear it too much today, spoken, though I think the sentiment may still be there. There is this notion that in that era, especially because we were closer to that fire and brimstone type of church going, that Black people are cursed, and if you know the story of Ham and Noah and the curse on Black people. And so there is this tendency to sort of regard them as a people in need of saving. There's a school of thought that was prominent among slaveholders that slavery was good for Black people because it helped to make them more docile. It helped to cool their lust and their loins and all of this nature. So all of this stuff. So religious instruction was good. What they didn't want was so the piety was allowed, but what they didn't want was the imagination and the connection between, say, if you look at Joseph Cinque and the Amistad, finding common cause between, well, I'm reading this story about Exodus, and then I'm looking at my family and myself in bondage, and I'm seeing lots of, then I'm looking at how Moses solved his problem. Wait, so they didn't want that sort of enlightenment. But what they really wanted to instill was the fear. And I was telling a colleague earlier today, even today in the modern era, the rulers of the society, it is not necessary that the masses of people know the technical nuances and the critical nuances of history, the names, the dates, the places, the face. All you have to be left with is the impression. Lincoln freed the slaves, Washington never told a lie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in this era, I think it was the same thing. So let us provide a very rigid, a very crude, if you will, form of religious, not education, but indoctrination into this idea. And then when you go into it, there's of course a color hierarchy where God is white, the angels are white, the saints are white, everyone's white. And then the thing with the color dichotomies within religious and racial religious imagery. So those sorts of things sort of, I think, went into and animated the thought of these religious minded Mohonkers. And then they also thought too, on the other side of it, that after we engage in these forms of service and missionary zeal, we ourselves can get into heaven. It will absolve us because, look what we did for the poor and lowly. We were able to do something that lifted them and gave a boat, food to the hungry and water to the thirsty. And look at what we did for the lowliest of your creatures, oh God. So there was all of that working as well in a lot of them. And they thought that sort of thrift, that sort of attention to unhoused and an aggrieved Black population would help them get to the pearly gates in a quicker way.
And I love how you illustrated how, first you define the problem as, unruly and ungovernable and brutish. And then the solution is, well, we'll civilize you just enough. And
just
that
enough.
civilization just enough also extended to the socioeconomic.
Mm.
The education, unlike classical education that certain white people were getting, the classics and Latin and all that kind of stuff, was never open for African Americans. It was always vocational. And talk about how the Mohawkins, well, people at Mohawk, really tried to structure the educational system strictly to be not inquisitive, not critically thinking, but really just gearing people towards that social service kind of area.
Right. Right. Yeah, because see, the other thing too, and this is, I think, is a great initial response to your question, is that it wasn't just these Mohonkers weren't just interested in religious instruction for the sake of religious instruction. They were interested in religious instruction because they were trying to create a societal hierarchy and a social order and an economic order, which you hinted at earlier. And so we need to make the indoctrination align with the kind of vision that we have for the society. So, what use of it? We have a use for people in this rapidly developing industrial space. We need people to empty buckets and to change the hooves on horses and stuff like that. And so, if I introduce them to Shakespeare and Homer, is that a practical use of their time? And this is where the social engineering part comes in, because it is someone outside of yourself determining what you need, determining how your thinking should be developed and shaped. Not just yours, but your children's and that child's down generations down the line, because they're doing this for themselves as they exist in the present, but they're doing it for their children, for their unborn generations, because they're going to pass their fortunes on and they want their legacies to endure. And so we want to create a society where we can relax a little bit. And this is another point, I think, related to this point. And this is a difference between impulses among Black people for their own education and then impulses among these Mohonkers, is that our interests, especially those of us who are Pan-African like myself, and those who are sort of students, if you will, of the Black radical tradition, we have always understood that in the internationalism, the international aspect of education was key and was foregrounded, because it is that which allowed us to create and convey common cause. And so we need to have a relationship with Africa, a la Marcus Garvey. We need to have a relationship with the Caribbean. We need to have a relationship with the global African diaspora. Whereas the Mohonkers, their vision was like this lonely nation of Negroes that are away from home, who are culturally detached, which is why they detested any kind of adherence to Africa. A lot of the African people who came over here were actually Muslims from West Africa. Many of them were adherents of Yoruba and Wolof and other forms of African worship. And so they shunned any sort of expression of Africa, especially the drum. And so you begin to see these different impulses and how these impulses came to play in terms of shaping education.
Yeah, and I like how you frame that too, because I think there's a whole generations of Africans who were very established in Africa, and for whatever reason ended up here. And that talent pool is completely lost, not only to history, but also to American civilization. So we have a whole group of people whose accomplishments and contributions are unsung, because they were still making these innovations and all this kind of stuff. And who knows what poetry never was written down? Who knows what novel was told, right? All that kind of stuff. So again, it's that terrible lost history of slavery. But I'd like to return to the Du Bois praxis now, and just kind of, you've been doing it throughout the whole conversation here, but if you had to summarize the Mohonk Conference through the kind of the Du Bois Black educational lens, where do you end up, and how is it continued to react to, as we said at the beginning, this conversation with white supremacy that continues today. So I guess what I'm asking is, where were we, what happened, and where we are today?
Yeah. Well, I think we're not too far, unfortunately, it pains me to say. I think we're not too far removed from where we were because, as you know, exertions that are undertaken to actually implement culturally informed exploration, particularly in the realm of teaching and curriculum and development, teacher training, those things, especially today, there's been an assault on them, especially within the last 5 to 6 years. And so the assault is not just, say, a local school district, say in Shaker Heights, rejecting and objecting to a curriculum that was an African-centered curriculum. No, no, it's now whole like state politicians and policymakers and fueled by lots and lots of different forms of lubricant. And it is these things that are kind of challenging and in some cases foreclosing these culturally informed exertions to look at not just for Black people, but culturally informed. I'm a teacher educator. And so I teach cultural foundations courses, and we emphasize the history, the humanity, and the heritage of all children, all human cultural groups. That's everybody on the planet. And we try, my approach to it is very simple. We connect culture to children and then children to academic excellence. They need to be able to see themselves in the curriculum. So I think that whole fear and that whole resistance, unfortunately, is still with us. I think the resistance to Black agency is still there, obviously. I'm from Chicago, but I work in Indianapolis. And just 3 days ago, some Republican politician floated a proposal to to collapse, I think like 8 or 10 different school districts. I don't need to tell you what zip code these schools are in. I don't need to tell you the complexion of the students that attend these schools. But they wouldn't, and they want to convert these public schools into charters. And then, of course, they want to take the public money and they want to create elite charter schools, and they want to take the public money that was going to the public schools proper, and they want to divert that into the hands of cronies and elite others and stuff like that. So it's the same kind of game that's afoot. Lots and lots of changes have been implemented in order to keep things the same. And last I'll put on that is that those sort of imperialist exertions, those sort of extreme sort of modes of oppression, they are very durable. I do not say they will be with us forever because they have not always been here and will not always be here. And they are very strong, quite strong and durable, but they are not stronger than resistance and oppression against them. Because I really believe that there are far more good people in the world, people who really understand and who really authentically love children and want to see human cultural groups flourish, resisting greed and resisting tyranny. I believe there are more people on the planet that are in this camp than in that other camp. It's just that we have to create these, and this is something that was true of that era and true of this era. We have to find what my good friend and colleague, Dr. Joyce King, she refers to it as a collective humanity. What are the things that unite us and make us human? And then how can we build on those things? We bring factions together the same way we bring fractions together. We look for that least common denominator and then we build on that and grow from it.